This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And this episode is the first in a 4-part series exploring the question of how and why are we experiencing such an abundance in food, shelter, technology, which is, while not benefiting everyone equally by any means, has really lifted living standards across the board so that an archaeologist studying humans a millennia from now would notice that you suddenly start to have the same species leaving behind skeletons that are noticeably taller and taller and taller, who live longer, who live in bigger buildings. And all of this happening while there are also more and more and more of these humans. So how did this era of modern prosperity come to be? During the 1.5 years of running the On Humans podcast, I've had the pleasure and the honor of talking with a lot of leading economic historians about these questions. And these are often quite long episodes. We take different angles and explore various things. But I have noticed that there is a kind of core theme that runs throughout them, which is that the typical theory, the standard theory that, well, the steam engine was invented in the 1700s, we had the Industrial Revolution, the rest is history. It doesn't really seem to capture the real important changes leading to these dramatic changes that we've experienced. And that rather than focusing on the 1770s with the Watt steam engine, a lot of the people, pretty much every single economist I've talked to, focuses on the period around 1870s. 1870s is not a decade that most people spend their time thinking about. Few people can even name a single event from 1870s. And yet many of the guests I've had on the show have considered this to be a kind of watershed moment. One of my guests, Brad DeLong, calls it the hinge of history. So what happens there? Now, to explore this matter, I've decided to run a 4-part series, which is composed not of new material, but of summarized, edited, crystallized nuggets of wisdom, around half an hour each, from the 4 relevant episodes. Towards the end of this series, we'll hear from the most cited economic historian alive, Daron Acemoglu, about how he sees that this was an era where democratic politics and labor unions finally were able to distribute the accumulating wealth to the broader basis of society. In episode 4, we'll hear from one of the leading scholars of global inequality, Branko Milanovic, about the very many surprising things that happened to inequalities within and between countries during and after the 1870s. In part 2, we'll hear from Brad DeLong about why he literally uses the word hinge of history for 1870s and how he sees that it was things like the Industrial Research Lab that really launched humanity into a new kind of era where it was for the first time not necessarily the reality, but it was a possibility to give to everyone as much as they needed for a healthy, good life. But in this very first episode, I talk with Oded Galor, author of the really slim but remarkably ambitious book, The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. And we had a really epic conversation with him. It was spread out between 2 episodes, many, many hours. And this is a condensed 25-minute section of that conversation, which explains as briefly as possible, but I think in a very understandable way, Galor's theory of why the shape of the economic history of humanity changes and how this allows especially rich Western countries to take off. And he also, towards the end of this episode, which mostly focuses on positive trends like education, he also gives, I think, a really, really interesting angle into the way that this story has been significantly less happy for countries on the receiving end of European colonialism like India. So there's a lot in these 25 minutes. So without further ado, let's get started with the first episode in the 4-part series of the birth of modern prosperity. So here is Professor Oded Galor, who will begin by explaining the grand arc of human history from the agricultural Neolithic revolution over 10,000 years ago, all the way to the present.
So in contrast to the views of some, that since the Neolithic revolution, we see a gradual improvement in living standards over the planet as a whole, what in fact we see is a gradual improvement in the level of technology, but no change in the standard of living that is long-lasting.
You have some wonderful data around this. You said that estimates suggest that wages for a workday were around 7 kilograms of wheat grains in Babylon, 5 kilograms in the Assyrian Empire, and this is more than 3,000 years ago. 11 to 15 kilograms in Athens, 4 kilograms in Egypt, and even in the verge of the Industrial Revolution, you're in Amsterdam, you get 10 kilograms for a work day. You're in Paris, you get 5. you're in Madrid or Naples, you get 3 to 4. So there really doesn't seem to be much of a difference in which of these epochs you're living in terms of how much you get for your work a day.
Indeed, indeed. So that's an accurate characterization of the evolution of human societies. We do not see much differences in the standard of living over time or across space. What we see are differences in population densities. Namely, societies that are more advanced technologically tend to be more densely populated than otherwise. So this is a striking difference from today's world, in which naturally technologically advanced societies are the most prosperous societies. In the past, technologically advanced societies had larger population, but largely not richer population. So we start with a modest population of humans in Africa 300,000 years ago, and sooner or later, given the capacity of the human brain to innovate, this population is able to make some progress in terms of technology. Now, naturally, this is not the pace of progress that we see today. This is basically a movement from one stone technology to another stone tool technology. But nevertheless, these changes in the technology that human possess at the time permits more humans to be supported. And in turn, the size of the human population is contributing to further technological progress. So in the course of human history, we see this reinforcing cycle. More people, faster technological progress, progress, more people and more adaptable people. Now, the process is very slow at any point in time, but nevertheless, over a 300,000 year period, we reach a stage in which the pace of technological progress is so rapid that in order to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment, individuals must start to invest in their education. Parents start to invest in the education of their children, but in fact, they have very limited budgets. They live very close to the subsistence level of consumption, and in order to afford investment in education, they must economize on another item on their budget constraint. They cannot economize on their consumption, and as a result of it, they reduce the number of children. And it is this decline in fertility that permits the growth process to be freed from the counterbalancing effect of population and permits the world to sail into the sustained growth regime.
So what you're saying is that there is a gradual, constant improvement in human technology. This is what marks our species in a way, our humongous brain and the consequent capacity to constantly develop new tools, better technologies.
Indeed.
And for a short period of time, yes, this makes the people who figured out this new technology a bit better off, but that eventually means less children will be dying of starvation, and therefore they will have more children to sustain, and eventually this population growth will kind of eat away the extra income that might have been produced. You have some good data around this. You have some data, for example, from Ireland, how the potato, when it was introduced in Ireland, first led to a lot more income available, then led to a population boom in Ireland, and therefore the income per capita actually ends up coming back to where it was before the potato. You have similar data around maize in China. What would be your favorite data point to make this claim?
So again, I think that the example of Ireland is a fantastic one, because it shows us how the importation of this crop from the New World into Europe and ultimately into Ireland generated an enormous population boom. I mean, the population in Ireland increases by a factor of 4, almost 5, over a 200-year period, but we do not see much improvement in the standard of living. So we see a better technology, a better crop that is suitable for the soil that existed in Ireland. And this crop is ultimately permitting more people to be sustained, but it does not make them more prosperous than otherwise. And then what is interesting in the context of the Ireland case is that we see, in fact, the reverse process as well. At a certain point, we see the potato blight. It is affecting the crops in Ireland. And this destruction in this new technology is generating the Irish famine, mass starvation, and exodus of enormous population from Ireland into England and into the New World. So this is a sort of a classical Malthusian fluctuation: better technology, more people, not more prosperous people; destruction of technology, less people, again, as well off as they were before. And as you mentioned, I mean, we can think about it in the context of the implementation of maize in China too. And it is quite apparent that those regions of China that implemented the maize first generated an enormous population increase, but without any effect on the standard of living over this time period. And an additional piece of evidence is basically cross-country evidence, where it is quite apparent that when you look at the effect of better technology on income per capita, we do not see any effect. But when we look at the effect of better technology on population density, the effect is tremendously positive.
And at some point, this dynamic changes. You have an interesting way, I guess, of both rediscovering Thomas Malthus as someone who actually was quite right as a thinker, that the British intellectual who was rather pessimistic about the future of humanity. He thought that this mechanism that is now named after him would always bring humans back towards subsistence. And you kind of, and he's been forgotten to some extent. Not necessarily forgotten, but he's this kind of a classic, well, he wasn't quite right, kind of a character. And what I hear you saying is that, well, he was 100% right until his own time, when everything suddenly changed, and then he was 100% wrong ever after.
Yeah, that's perfectly accurate. I mean, so it's quite ironic. I mean, he was perfectly right about the way that economic forces operated up till the time when he wrote the book. But quite ironically, immediately after the conclusion of the writing of his book, the world, in fact, started to change quite dramatically, and economies started to escape from what we define today as the Malthusian trap.
And I guess that we should now soon start talking about how did how did we escape this trap? What happens, and why is this not just a story of the steam engine happening and us being able to harness the energy in fossil fuels, and therefore having such an abundance of surplus that no amount of population growth can take it away from us? What happens in your view, and why is it not as simple as that?
What we see over this time period is a phase transition. So let's think about a phase transition that we are all familiar with, that occurs in nature, the transition from liquid to gas. So if we heat water in a kettle, and initially we do not see a change in the phase of the water. In fact, they remain liquid. But then as we continue the process and the water temperature reaches a critical threshold, typically 100 degrees Celsius, then we see the transition from water to gas. And this is a very abrupt process. So there is a gradual buildup up to the critical point, and beyond the critical point, we see a phase transition. Now, the same occurs in the course of human history. As I said earlier, we start with a modest population in Africa. This modest population innovates. Innovation supports more people innovate more than otherwise, and this reinforcing interaction is ultimately generating sufficiently rapid technological progress to which individuals must respond, in the sense that the environment is changing so rapidly that human capital or education becomes essential for the ability of individuals to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment. And why is this critical? Because investment in human capital is costly. In order to invest in the education of your children, you must economize on other elements in your budget constraint, namely, you must economize on the number of children. And this is critical because it suggests to us that this level of technological progress is ultimately converted into richer people rather than into more people.
Now, it makes sense when we look at the world today and the world 200-300 years ago to say that, yes, nowadays when people get rich, they don't invest that typically in having extra children. But there seems to be something difficult in this story, at least at first glance, because what people typically know about this Industrial Revolution period, the 1800s especially, if they don't know anything else, they've seen these graphs of maybe fossil fuels spiking, but especially population growth, this dramatic population growth that has taken place in the last 200 years. And so how is it? I mean, it seems to be something ironic, at least, if we are explaining the escape from the Malthusian mechanism with the taking away of rapid population growth as a mechanism, but then we are applying this to a period which sees the most rapid population growth in human history. What would be your response?
Yes, so the argument is quite straightforward. So this interaction between population and technology is bringing about an enormous increase in the size of the human population on the one hand, and enormous increase in the pace of technological progress. So if you think about the time period since the Neolithic Revolution until the Industrial Revolution. This is about 12,000 year period. The size of the world population in the eve of the Neolithic Revolution is about 2.5 million people. The size of the human population in the early phases of industrialization is about 1 billion people. Namely, the size of the world population is increasing 400-fold despite being in a Malthusian epoch. What permits us, as we said earlier, is acceleration in technological progress. So we moved from stone tool technology that existed, say, 300,000 years ago to steam engine technology in the eve of the Industrial Revolution. And it is this change in technology that permits an enormous increase in the size of the world population. Now, we reach a point in which there is a race between technology and population. And technological progress becomes so rapid that biological reproduction is not sufficiently rapid to keep pace with this process. And this is what I defined as the post-Malthusian regime. Namely, we reach a point in which technology is advancing so rapidly and population growth is very, very rapid. Nevertheless, since biological reproduction is a lengthy process, technology has the upper hand, and we start to see the growth in income per capita. But this is not sustained economic growth because, in fact, much of it, 2/3 of it, or 4/5 of it, is consumed by the increase in the size of the human population. And it is the demographic transition that occurs, say, in Western Europe in the 1870s that frees the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population. And despite the fact that the world population in absolute level is increasing dramatically, the rate of population growth declines dramatically. The rate of technological progress is enormous. And consequently, we see this enormous growth, 14-fold increase in income per capita in the past 200 years.
So would it be correct then to say that the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the early 1800s, there the question is mostly about just suddenly being able to produce so much surplus that the population growth is not able to consume it all? And then post 1870 in Western Europe and post more recent times in other parts of the world, there we really have a new phase where the Malthusian forces are no more existing because of the new way that families are planning their children's numbers and education.
Indeed, that's precisely right. And ultimately, we see the emergence of mass education that did not exist earlier. So child labor was a constant phenomenon in the course of human history. It's not unique to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, it was really taking a particular form. But ultimately, as we see in the course of what we defined as the Industrial Revolution, and what I would like to define as the age of progress, is that ultimately child labor is being abolished, or it is gradually fading precisely over this time period.
And you make the case that actually it was the industrialists themselves that were lobbying for public education.
Indeed. So that's very interesting. So naturally, at a certain point, when technological progress is accelerating, there is a large demand for human capital, for educated people that can cope and it was this rapidly changing technological environment. Now, parents, being responsible as they may be, most of them are too poor to invest in the education of their children. And consequently, industrialists realize that this is the time in which, in fact, investment in education can sustain their profit rates. If you think about the Marxian viewpoint of the world, Marx is suggesting to us that capital accumulation is going to lead into competition across capitalists, exploitation, and ultimately into a class struggle because the workers will have nothing to lose but their chains. But what we see in reality is that capitalists realize sooner or later that the only way to sustain their profit rates is, in fact, to assure that their labor force is more educated than otherwise. They cannot invest in the education of their workers directly because workers can simply cross the street and move into a different firm and their investment will be lost. And consequently, they lobby in the British Parliament quite aggressively to assure that public education is being enacted. And they're, in fact, behind the Education Act of 1870 and ultimately behind the Balfour Act of 1902, in which in England, education became compulsory, universal, and free.
But that would suggest, wouldn't it, that it would be those places that are most industrial that have the most investment in public education? Correct me if I'm wrong, but my kind of gut reaction is to say that France, for example, was leading the way to public education in Europe, not Britain. And not necessarily from an industrialist point of view, maybe more from a nation building point of view.
Indeed. So in fact, we see massive investment in education in England much later than we see in continental Europe. But this is a response to the industrialization that is taking place in England. In continental Europe, education initially is motivated by other reasons. It has to do with social cohesiveness, nation building, military needs of the bureaucracy, etc.
Okay, well, if I understand correctly, the basic picture then is that with industrialization, we start to experience this new need for human capital, for education of the workforce, meaning our children, and therefore families start to reduce the amount of children that they get. One of the historic points that might be used as a counter argument against this is China. So China has a very long tradition of social mobility being linked to education, of a millennium of civil servants being taken in by exams, and therefore a pretty strong cultural current which pushes parents to invest in their education. Now, it's also associated with a culture of wealthy men having a lot of concubines and producing as much offspring almost as possible. Do you think that China is a counter example to this, because there you don't seem to have emphasis on education being coupled with this reduction of family size?
Right. So some of these forces of what we define today as the quantity-quality trade-off are operating in China, but they are not broad-based in the sense that there is no mass participation in this process, and consequently it doesn't have an effect that can generate a movement into a sustained growth regime. And in addition, China has other limitations that prevent an early transition from stagnation to growth.
I think talking about China can serve as a great bridge towards the second part of your book, which deals with the origins of inequality, especially inequality between nations. I mean, we all know that China is on the rise currently, but there's still, I think, the GDP per capita in China is still 1/6 or so of the US. I learned from your book that the average American farmer produces around 40 times more goods than the average Chinese farmer. So there's still huge inequalities even between countries like China and the US. And this obviously poses the question, why? Why did this escape from the Malthusian trap, this emergence of the modern growth regime? Why did it happen in Europe and not in Asia, for example, in China? And why did it spread so efficiently to some European spin-offs like the US and not to others like Brazil, for example? One of the obvious answers would be, especially if talking about the relationship, the difference between Europe and Asia, would be colonialism. And I think that you take colonialism very seriously, and you have a very helpful discussion on it. I mean, you write African countries whose populations were most affected by enslavement and forced migration have less developed economies to this day. I think the discussion, though, about India was most clarifying for me. Could you talk a little bit about the dynamics in the Indian colonial experience and how colonialism in India served the British growth regime and hindered the Indian growth regime?
Right. So when we think about inequality across nations today, it is very important to note that much of the inequality as we see it today is originated due to the differential timing of the takeoff across the globes. Some societies are taking off first, others are delayed. So the second part of the book is trying to peel different layers of influence that could affect inequality today. I start initially precisely with the force that you're asking me about, which is the forces of colonialism. How much of the inequality that we see in the world today can be attributed to this uneven relationship between colonial powers and the nations that were colonized. So if we think about India and England in the middle of the 18th century, and you focus on the textile industry, the textile industry in India is quite advanced at the time. And it is not obvious that this textile industry would not have been advanced even further in the absence of colonial relationship that emerged later. So then we see the emergence of colonial relationship. And England is basically either imposing certain terms of trade or inducing India to specialize in the production of raw material and agricultural goods, from which there are limited spillovers and limited demand for human capital. Why is it so important? Remember that what permitted societies to take off from stagnation to growth is, in fact, technological acceleration and its impact on human capital formation and consequently the demographic transition. So what we see in the context of these trade relationships is that India and England are pushed to different extremes. In India, we see specialization in the production of raw material, agricultural goods that have limited demand for education or human capital. In England, we see precisely the opposite: specialization in the production of industrial goods that are human capital, education intensive. So in the two societies, the forces are such that in England, we see higher demand for human capital and an earlier onset of the demographic transition. In India, we see depressed demand for human capital and delayed in the demographic transition till the second half of the 20th century. Gains from trade, the gains from trade are converted in India into more people, and the gains from trade in England converted into more prosperous people.
Yeah, a fascinating piece of data I learned was GDP per capita in Britain has grown during the past couple of centuries, pretty much the same amount as the population has in India.
Indeed. So if you think about, when we think about total output, what a country is producing, a total income, it is composed of two components. It is income per person times the number of people. So when total income is growing, it can be due to the fact that income per person is growing or population is growing or both. And what I show is that in the context of India, most of the growth is generated by the growth of the size of the population rather than the material well-being of the population. So in the two economies can grow in a very similar fashion due to the gains from trade, but the composition is very different. And as a result of it, we have a lot of people in India that are very impoverished, and we have fewer people that are prosperous in England.
Because economically, Britain exported those bits that were not the human capital intensive, did not require education, did not make it into a self-serving policy for the industrialists to educate the people, and therefore for the families to limit their family size.
Precisely. So there are two important elements: human capital and technological spillovers. Technological spillovers from the production of raw material and agricultural goods are very limited. Technological spillovers from the industrial sector are sizable, but perhaps most importantly, greater demand for human capital and ultimately differential effect on the demographic transition.
Okay, so that was the end of part 1 in the series on the origins of modern prosperity. Now, Galor's theory is one where technology improves gradually, but it reaches a kind of threshold around 1870s where level of technology is so high that it starts requiring mass participation in education for people, for example, in England, to be able to participate economically with these new technologies. Now, this is one way of looking at the change around 1870s. Now, the guest in the second part of this series largely agrees with Galor that this is the right moment to zoom in. This is Brad DeLong. And with DeLong, we go in a bit more detail, looking at what kind of a world did people live in before 1870s, why steam engine, industrial revolution early on did not really benefit the masses, he says, and why this changes. And he looks at something else. He doesn't focus so much on demographic structure, family size, education, but more on, well, the brute fact that we just get so good at inventing new things as humans with industrial research labs, engineers, that inventing becomes the new norm. Now, why this happens, how does it impact the world? What was the world like before? What was the world like after? And why are we not living in utopia today? Are topics that we'll cover in the part 2 with Brad DeLong. Until then, take care.